And going on to this thing of change, what I'd look at today are two things you asked about. Number one, death and dying, and the other is the concept of marriage. I'd like to begin with reading a passage you know almost by heart, but bear with me. It's from the book of Ecclesiastes, and it's in the 3rd chapter if you ever need to look it up. It says, "There's a season for everything, and a time for every occupation under heaven. A time for giving birth, a time for dying, a time for planting, a time for uprooting, a time for killing, a time for healing, a time for knocking down, and a time for building." And it goes on and on. You're very familiar with the passage. And what this talks about is basically the appropriateness of things in human life. When you begin to study wisdom literature in the Bible, wisdom literature seems to see that the primary thing that makes wisdom is prudence. It's not so much what a person does, it's a person knowing the appropriate things in their life. I think I've told you before that my grandfather, my family's very long-lived, and so my grandfather was very clear with me about this. Like, he sat me down. I was probably 10 years old. My grandfather sat me down. He said, "What do you plan on doing with your life?" And I gave him some innocuous thing. And basically what he wanted was my bucket list. So he reworded it, and so I knew what he was going to ask. But just as an example, that I'd heard different things I really wanted to do. One of the things I wanted to do was climb Half Dome. My dad said, "Do it when you're in college." My grandfather said, "Do it when you're in college. Make sure that gets done while you're in college." I said, "Okay." Another thing I wanted to do was go on a cruise. There's a paddle wheel that leaves St. Louis and goes to New Orleans down the Mississippi and stops at many of the antebellum homes and stuff. It's a wonderful trip. And I said, "I really want to do that." He says, "Wait till your 90s. He says, and go ahead.
The Cardinal from Argentina, Bergoglio, he's taking
Oh.
the name Francis.
Francis? Oh, good. I guess I can turn off my phone. It is the Cardinal from Argentina, and he's taking the name Francis. Yeah. I remember hearing a description of all of them, but I don't remember the one particularly of him. Anyway, my grandfather explained to me that you do not have to be extremely healthy to sit on a deck and sip mint juleps. Okay? So I haven't done that yet, and I've completed Half Dome. But anyway, he set these down as to understand, that you can actually do everything. You just need to set it up appropriately, age-wise. And so I think part of that is understanding two things. Number one, understand that the process that you and I go through, you have to accept it's a good process. I think one of the funny things oftentimes is when a little kid lives for the day when they can drive and be away from home, and then you spend the rest of your life wishing you were young, and you never actually hit an age that you want. It never actually comes. And the thing is to learn that the process is good. Remember we talked about that passage from Jeremiah where God says, I have nothing but good in store for you. And so the idea of somehow coming to this kind of consensus and realizing again that change is good. It's a good part of our lives, and learning to adjust to it. I'm going through the life, death and dying thing. Understand first of all that death is not a thing. Death is actually the end of a thing. Death is the end of life. So when we're talking about death, what we're really talking about, everyone's going to die. That's kind of a given. And so what we need to do is talk about how we approach the process. And I will tell you, one of the things that really struck me, I guess maybe in seminary training or something, I'd picked up this idea of the deathbed repentance where a person is really distraught and this sort of thing. Do you know, I have never attended one dying person who ever regretted anything they did. Never. But I've attended hundreds of people who regretted things they had not done. And I wish I'd done so-and-so. I wish I could have. And where this, incidentally, is one of the major things today is with reconciliation. That a person on their deathbed realizes they do not have the ability to go and at least try and reconcile with a person who at least has the good sense not to come to them. Okay? But they find this in their own lives. And so one of the things to understand is that weigh things in your life as you go through, and chances and things you take and stuff. Am I going to regret having done this? Am I going to regret having missed this? And an example, my sister phoned me one time that she'd paid the money for a cruise and everything was all set up and everything. And then one of her sons, who, like most people today, was living with a girlfriend, had finally made the decision, he and the girlfriend was going to join the church. They were going to get married in church. They had it all kind of set up. And in many dioceses, if two people have been living together for a while, and most people don't even know they aren't married, the marriage is a rather quick thing and a simple thing, provided the requirements are met. So this marriage was like right on the scene. And my sister called me and she says, I don't really know what to do. I said, it's a very simple thing. Sit down, no one else around, and just think very carefully. Are you going to most regret missing the cruise or most regret missing the marriage? And whichever you will most regret, do. Okay? Whichever it is, that's very peculiar to you. And sit down and just figure it out. And so she did. She went to the marriage. But the idea is, in human life, when you make decisions, try and look at the idea of regret. Will I regret missing this? There are a lot of things that you and I can delay. It isn't really a matter of missing at all. And there are some things that if we delay, may never come again. Okay? And always think in that terms of regret. So in the whole thing of dying, I think that this process of dying, and I notice it in myself, and I'm sure everyone here who's older notices the process of dying is a many-year process. That I think, as they say, a baby is dying as it comes out of the womb. But you're probably, depending on your health and everything, you're probably well into your 50s or early 60s before it ever occurs to you that you actually might die. But from that point on, you begin to notice little signs of what are, in fact, the process of death. And so this process of dying, what you want to do is concentrate on life, not on concentrating on the death thing. And I'll give you an image that we had a bishop in San Diego who, on the same day, celebrated 25 years as Bishop of San Diego and 50 years as a priest. And so there was a massive celebration in this grand hotel in San Diego. And I've never seen anything done like this. If any of you have been to San Diego, it was the El Cortez, when it was a big hotel. But when you went into the dining room, there was this conveyor belt that came out of the kitchen and went back into the kitchen. And what it was hors d'oeuvres. And now there are thousands of people there. It was a big thing, so this was a way to do it. And I oftentimes think of life that way, that, these things are going by. Pick carefully, and you can't really grab them all. I know, I tried, but you can't really grab them all. But you want to make sure, you don't regret the choice you made. That's all. And so keep going on. I was telling a friend of mine there who was a friend of mine in the engineering school, and I was telling him about the hors d'oeuvres. I wish I could take. He says, I can tell you how to stop the belt. I said, thank you. No. Anyway. Another thing is to know the benefit of specific ages. And I'll tell you, like with regards to my grandfather, like for instance, this cruise thing that I told you I want to do, it's actually making me look forward to being older because then I can do that. I'm not going to do that now. And he had a knack for making it that you looked forward to. Each age had things to do. And so that you make it something you look forward to. And the reason being, it's inevitable. Okay, so you either look forward to it or you regret it, but by God, you're going there. That's the way it goes, okay? So, but this idea of knowing the benefit of specific ages so that you can actually be prepared for what's coming. And the other thing is that old age in many ways, as you age, you'll more and more realize things that were truths in your entire life. An example would be, we mentioned about the idea of dying. I was always dying. I just didn't notice it till I was late in my 60s. But I was always dying. Everybody is. But right now, I think the big thing I notice is dependence. I have an adopted son, and my adopted son is 50 years old this year, and he's in Redlands, California, and his wife and children are down there. And he comes up and spends 3 days every 2 weeks with me. Just comes up, spends 3 days at the house, and then goes back to Redlands. But it's interesting to me that things that used to be very simple to me are now impossible to me. Like they're reaching places I can't reach. They're things that, like getting up on one of these little ladders where, I might have fallen off and bruised my elbow, is now falling off and breaking your hip. So, I mean, it's a different thing. No light bulb's worth that. So, I mean, when he comes, I have, if he were other than my son, you'd call it a honey-do list. But anyway, when he comes in, I have this list of things. And I look at the list, it gets longer all the time. And I am more and more amazed at what I'm incapable of. With the best of intentions, you simply can't do it. That's all. This is closed. Okay? But do you know what that reminds me of? And I've made it a constant meditation, is that with each year of my life, I have become more aware of my dependence. And I could not survive if it weren't he or someone else coming to do certain things. I am absolutely dependent to survive. And what it reminds me of, or what it alerts me to, is that in my entire life I was totally dependent. It's just that God and people so met all my needs, I never knew it. And now I have the great privilege of realizing it. I survived to this age because people took care of me. And I didn't even know I needed to be taken care of. And the great privilege now is I know. I actually know. It's given me a new way of viewing God and viewing lots of people in my life who I don't think even knew they were taking care of me at set times. We do a lot of that with one another without any consciousness at all. But to learn to find the benefit of specific ages. One of the things we're going to talk about tomorrow with regards to change has to do with prayer and how the way we pray changes and that sort of thing. And this is another thing to notice, that aging helps you realize more and more about the thing. I think most of, a good example is that when you go through what is an age of dependence on your parents, and then an age of proving you aren't dependent on your parents, and then an age of proving your parents knew absolutely nothing, and then you have a baby, and the whole thing turns around. And you then call her to find out what you're supposed to do with this wet, crying little bundle. And you go through the whole thing. But to understand that age when you get the baby helps you to realize what the mother was all along. She was there doing that before you realized it. But each age gives you another realization. And you have to realize, if I could use the example, that everything that has happened to you in your life in all these things are actually God reaching at you through different individuals. And to understand that each of these things teaches you more of God. And that's why your prayer should become richer and richer as you get older. That each of these things will teach you more about God. And it has to do with the very process of aging. Okay? I don't know if many of you like the singer Enya. I really like her music. But one of the songs she sings, the closing line is, "You have to travel far to find out who you are." And that's one of the things of aging. In the process of aging is ultimately a process of you finding out who you are and a process of finding out who God is, because you know who God is through you. You are the image of God. So the more you know of you, the more you know of God. And if you'll look at the process of aging, thinking the next stage of aging is actually going to teach me more about God, then it's a wonderful thing, you know? And to come to this, and you need to, you know, the thing of compassion. There's a Jewish rabbi who's started doing a series of commentaries on Scripture that are very good, and they're from a very different angle than a Catholic would do it. But as an example, he's talking about Abraham sacrificing his son. And one of the things he says is, if you remember early in the story of Abraham, his slave Hagar had his son Ishmael. And so he threw out Hagar and Ishmael on the advice of Sarah. And he gave them basically a loaf of bread and a jug of water, which was, you know, like a death sentence. They went out in the thing. And this rabbi says the reason that God is asking Abraham to sacrifice Isaac is so Isaac will know what it means for a parent to watch a child die, because he did not have compassion for Hagar because he never felt that. So God wanted him to understand. And once you put that in your mind, it's very interesting, because like if you go into the story of Jacob, do you remember Jacob deceived his father so he could get the thing? So what happens? Jacob is deceived by his father-in-law into marrying the wrong woman. And this whole idea that maybe all through the thing, what God is trying to teach us in life is compassion. And you and I can't understand compassion till we experience the other side of the service thing, you know? And the older we get, the more of that we need. So the more of it we experience, and the more of it we experience, the more we understand God's involvement in our lives. Okay? So basically, the whole thing of death and dying is actually, number one, understand that it is a good process. And the second thing to understand is that it is actually a matter of life. And the idea is, as you and I march toward death, and we're marching towards death whether we like it or not, the key is to live. In the process, live. Don't neglect life. And there are many people, I'll use the example of Howard Hughes, who's the worst example. But Howard Hughes was so afraid of dying that he locked himself in a hotel, I think it was in Caracas, and occupied an entire floor. He sat on a wooden chair in the center of a room, stark naked, and there were around him a series of doctors and nurses who brought him his food. He ate it there. They took things away from him. He wouldn't touch anything that anyone else had touched. He was so concerned of dying. And the only thing he accomplished was he didn't live. You know, he wasn't dead, but by God, that's not life. I oftentimes think, you know, there's a bellhop in the basement in that hotel in Caracas who had to bring up his food, I'm sure. And the guy was probably working for 50 cents a day. But he had a life. And Hughes, the richest man in the entire world at the time, had nothing. The key thing is to understand life. And the process of dying is just moving further and further on in life. Don't let life pass you in the worry or the anticipation of dying. Live as much as you can within the perimeters. The perimeters are going to get smaller. And one of the things that happens is, as perimeters get smaller, you can always come to a deeper understanding than you can when perimeters are wider. And that's true of everything in human life. You know, if you were locked in a little cell and you were locked in there for several weeks, you'd know a huge amount about that cell. Someone walking through would never notice. And the thing is, in dying, you're actually concentrating life. And you learn more and more about the person who's living the life rather than the life they're living. And that's one of the great gifts of aging. The second half of this is I'd like to talk a little bit about marriage. There's a huge amount of research going on today about marriage. There is something very seriously wrong with marriage in our world today. And the scientists, they have some indication of what the difficulties are, they think, but they don't really know. One of the indications of the difficulties today, of course, is the rate of divorce. The rate of divorce is astronomical. And one of the things that scientists say is that we are living too long. And because we're living too long, a person actually goes through a series of marriages. Like, for instance, in the initial thing of marriage, you know, people got married like at the age of 12, had a baby that year, and both of them were dead before all the children were grown up. So their marriage was basically that. Whereas today, they see these different things. The first thing of marriage, they say, and I should say relationship, because a lot of this now happens outside of marriage. But let's say a man and woman, you know, begin to live together. The first thing is the relationship between the man and the woman. That is the first age of the marriage, and it really begins in courtship. Now remember, when marriage back there wasn't courtship either. Your father told you who you would marry. That was it. So there wasn't courtship. And in certain cultures, like in the in the Mid East rather, they honor the fact that you have never seen the bride or never seen the groom before the wedding in your entire life. Okay? Now, so if the photographer's really good, he can get this huge look of surprise. You know, but anyway, they try not to get that picture. But in that period, if we look in society, the major difficulty with that particular period of life is financial difficulties, financial limits. So a young couple that are first married, the big deal is financial limits, and financial limits will affect, you know, how they adjust to this. The second period in a marriage today has to do with children. So, and oftentimes a couple, you know, will end up with children very, very quickly before they've established kind of a relationship with one another. But in the vision of the church, what we would normally call courtship is supposed to be a time to develop a relationship with one another. And then the marriage is, you know, the time of children. But now oftentimes courtship is very curtailed, and they get married, they have children. But anyway, the big thing about being a parent is that you spend your life working under time limits. There are very serious time limits on being a parent. And that's because a lot of your time or energy is actually focused on other people than your spouse. And finally, we have the period that we call in the United States, we call it the empty nest thing. And it's when the children are gone, and the couple now, you know, the two are together usually without the financial limits that they had. Now, in the United States, we think of financial limits as, you know, I can't afford a Mercedes, okay? But a real financial limit is I can't get on a bicycle, you know? So as when you're retired, you usually don't have financial limits, so you're not endlessly wealthy, but you can basically make it through, and you don't have that thing you did at the beginning. But now you have health limits, and from that point on, you have health limits. And with each period, you have to work through a very, very different thing. And the husband and wife who were together originally, but have not gone through the process of children, when they're together at the end of the children thing.
His given name is Jorge Mario Bergoglio. Bergoglio. He has spent his entire life in Argentina. Of Buenos Aires. He's taken the name Francesco I after St. Francis of Assisi.
There's never been a Pope named Francis.
No, never been a Pope. That's what I've heard. He's the first non-European. He's the first South American. He's ordained a priest in 1969. He's 76 years old. I got the impression that he retired from being an archbishop. So he's coming out of retirement to take on the biggest job in the world. And let's see. He was elected on the 5th ballot, and it's the first time in 100 years that a pope has been elected on the 5th ballot. So whether that means they did it with fewer ballots before or more, I don't know. first.
It would have been fewer ballots before because they were always smaller
Yeah.
groups.
So you guys knew of him?
Yes.
He's a Jesuit. It said he's very humble. He sold his.
A humble Jesuit?
He said so himself. And the name Francis is very symbolic because Francis, St. Francis called poverty his sister poverty. And he sold the palatial cardinal's archbishop's residence in Buenos Aires and moved into a simple apartment. Got rid of his limousine and his driver and drives himself around. So he's very, very humble, even though he's
But I might point out that a Jesuit selling property has already violated his vows.
But he, you have to renounce being a Jesuit to be a bishop. No problem.
A lot of us have renounced being a Jesuit. Well, everyone will be in a panic to find out about him because I don't know a lot about him. Maybe that's the best way to get elected. But anyway, okay? So, what the idea here is the same thing we talked about earlier in the changes. To understand the evolution of the marriage is going to go through these stages, and to know it, that there's a classic thing, I'm sure you've heard it before, that every man goes into a marriage presuming the woman will never change, and every woman goes into marriage presuming she will change the man. Okay? They are both wrong. Okay? The woman does indeed change, the man does, but the woman doesn't change him. Okay? So anyway, this idea of knowing, I think a part of this, the same thing with the death and dying, is to know the inevitability of the evolution of the relationship. And a person who goes into the relationship, and this is very, very common, to go into the relationship, and you can just hear it in the way a couple talks before a marriage. They think nothing will ever change, that this is the way that, and they need to know, you need to go into the relationship knowing it's going to change and knowing the change is a good thing. And I think all of us know some married couples where actually you have watched the change be a very, very good thing for them. But like if I would cite the example, my great-grandparents were married 65 years. And they had the first celebration in their parish church of anyone ever married 62 years. When they were 62 years married, it was the first celebration ever in their church. Now, in the parish in which I came out of, in Spreckles, I was there 15 years, and I bet I celebrated at least one 60th anniversary a year. And we just live longer now, okay? We live much longer. One of the changes going on in the Catholic Church is the age at which people marry. The age at which people marry in the United States has moved into the early 30s and late 20s. Now, a lot of these people have actually been living together for a period of time, but the actual marriage thing has moved to a later period, okay? And I think there's a lot of things that people, kind of don't understand about the living together. We try and inform people on this, but statistically, people who've lived together before they get married do not have a strong chance of that marriage persisting. In fact, the remarkable thing to me is the number of people who decide to get married after they've been living together 10 or 12 years and are divorced within a year. It's just a strange thing. And so to understand that you're going to go through these changes and to learn how to prepare for the changes, like a husband and wife that are raising children and have never come to grips with the fact that the children will be gone one day and there will be the two of them, are very poorly prepared for retirement. One of the things they say you really need to know as a couple, that if you do not have separate lives, you don't have a lot to share. And if you don't have a way in which your lives are mixed, you don't have an opportunity to share. So a husband and wife want to, as they go through, because at the time you're raising children, that's it. That's what you're about, okay? But once you get out of that, the fact that, let's say, a husband and wife both play golf, good. But then he has an interest in this and she has an interest in that. And that's the thing you want to do. And that needs to be cultivated towards the time of retirement. That shouldn't just begin with retirement. The great danger to a woman is that her entire life is involved with the children. That is the great danger. And the great danger to a man is that his entire life is involved with his job. And when the job ends, from his point of view, the life is over. When the children leave, from her point of view, the life is older. And again, we're going to talk a little more about this tomorrow, which is the idea of allow your prayer to evolve. Your relationship, allow your prayer to evolve. And you might, as a couple, learn to pray more together. The prayer could be something that unites you. And incidentally, there are a lot of people involved in mixed religious marriages, and that doesn't seem to be in any sense an impediment to people allowing their prayer life to evolve together. Okay? And the other thing is that when you study in psychology, love always allows you to grow. I've had oftentimes had an opportunity to think about this. I'm sure I've told you a lot about this, but I am very, very seriously introverted because of the amount of time I spent as a very young child in the hospital, totally alone. And to this day, like if I were to come up here and there were no one in this room that I knew, I could not physically enter the room. Like sometimes I go off for conferences for priests. If there's no one I know there, I'll leave and just take a plane home. And the thing is, it's just a kind of a terminal shyness. But when I was in the seminary, it was probably the first time I had a very close friend. This young man came there. And because of coordination issues, I'd never been involved in sports. And because of the dyslexia, I'd never been an excellent student. And I think most schools are divided into the jocks and the nerds. And I would have been happy to be either, but was neither. And so when I met this guy in the seminary, he was in the same class. And he eventually left and got married. He comes see me periodically. But it was very interesting because he's the first person that as a peer, that I really felt, very, very close to. And during the period that he was with me with the seminary, he turned around my ability to deal with people. Like I started doing sports when he was there, and the thing that he was passionate about was handball. So he taught me handball. We played virtually every day, and I ended up winning the championship in San Diego 2 years running after having gone through him thinking I couldn't play sports. And they had a school play in the seminary. No one in their right mind who's shy gets on a stage in a play. But he would constantly encourage me, so I did. I never got an Academy Award, but I was involved in these. So, but the whole thing is that he really opened me. And one of the things that I believe is that true love always allows people to grow. And that's something you really want to be aware of. A person you're in love with, you really want to work for their growth. It is their responsibility to work for your growth. Okay? And that is one of the things that makes marriage go, is this idea of actually wanting to see the other person grow in happiness and experiences. And then the thing of the aging just works beside it. And eventually one of you will end up taking care of the other. I mean, that's the way it goes. And in case it's you that needs to be taken care of, be nice to your spouse now, okay? One day they may have their hand on the plug. You need to know that. And so you and I really want to do this. And they say the thing of a marriage is if two people who are deeply in love will make a personal commitment to one another to constantly challenge and encourage. That oftentimes you find in a marriage that people constantly challenge one another, and oftentimes that breaks it. Or people who simply encourage one another, it leads to very little growth. So you want to both encourage and challenge. A challenge is no good without encouragement. Encouragement is no good without a challenge. So you want to challenge and encourage and know that life is going to be different as it goes on. You have to come to that thing. And the other thing is that a couple needs to be able to find a way very early to present a union to the children. Okay? You know, one of the things they say in psychology is that act the way you want to be and soon you'll be the way you act. Well, I think one of the great blessings of a marriage is if a couple, you know, by their discussion and stuff, work out how they're going to deal with the kids. And I think, you know, that's an endless process because of things come up that you never believe anyone in their right mind would have to face. And so you have to, but to the degree you're able to present this united front to the kids, to that degree you actually become united in the very process. And when you look at it from that kind of a model, if you get back and look at it, you realize that all of marriage is aimed basically at the retirement thing. That you're being trained in the way you deal with one another, you're being drawn together, and everything is aimed at this. You remember that one of the things we read in the passage from Jeremiah that God says, I have good things prepared for you, and I'm asking on to understand that just as we talked about with aging, the whole process of aging up to death is actually life. And it's there for us to enjoy and be a part of. The whole thing of this process of marriage is aimed at the time when these two people, having had this fantastic accomplishment of raising kids that they hope they never see again as long as they live, will then have this time to be together and actually enjoy one another. Something that really, you know, like the early period, you're really getting to know one another. The middle period, you're too busy with the kids. But in the process, you've come to know one another. And at this point, knowing one another, you go into this process. But if you look at it that way, you know, it can all be good. A person needs to be able to look at this as good rather than bad. And I would encourage you in your own life, you know, we can constantly make jokes about the thing of aging and stuff like that. And I would caution you to self-reflect whether these jokes about aging are for you jokes or are in fact a way of eroding the fact that aging's a good thing. Because if it's eroding the fact that aging's a good thing, don't engage in it. I think that has very much to do with people. You know, some people, when you cut them down, it's a huge joke. Other people, when you cut them down, it's an insult. And so you have to determine how you deal with this stuff, okay? But I would say to the degree that jokes about aging make you think, you know, that aging's a bad thing, I'd stay away from it. You cannot afford to think aging is a bad thing. You're going to do it whether you like it or not, okay? So you cannot afford to think it's a bad thing. And the same thing about these different ages of marriage. Oh, what'll we do when the kids are gone? You cannot afford to think that way because you're going to have to do when the kids are gone, okay? And again, to have this great sense that all of human life is a journey on which God is leading us ultimately to Him. And there's something for us to learn and experience everywhere on the journey until the end of the journey, which is death. Okay, why don't we take a break?